The gravel crunched under my tires as I guided my truck up the winding mountain road. Pine trees crowded close on either side, their branches scraping against my windows like curious fingers. I'd been driving for nearly 3 hours since leaving the last town, following increasingly narrow roads until the GPS lost signal and I had to rely on the hand-drawn map the property management company had provided. When the cabin finally came into view, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. It was larger than I'd expected, a sturdy 2-story structure built from thick logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, which meant someone was already there. That would be David Parker, the current caretaker I was replacing for the winter season. I parked beside an older model pickup truck that had seen better days and grabbed my duffel from the passenger seat. Before I even reached the steps, the front door swung open, revealing a man I assumed was David. He stood in the doorway, watching me with an intensity that made me pause. "Thomas Mitchell?" he asked, his voice rough as the gravel beneath my boots. "That's me," I replied, climbing the last few steps. "You must be David." He nodded once, but didn't smile or offer his hand. Instead, he stepped back to let me enter. "Come in. We have a lot to cover before I leave." The interior of the cabin was warm and well kept. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the main room featured comfortable but utilitarian furniture. Nothing fancy, but practical for a mountain retreat. The wooden walls were bare except for a few landscape photographs and what looked like a hunting rifle mounted above the mantel. "Put your things anywhere," David said, already walking toward the kitchen. "This way." I dropped my bag near the couch and followed him. The kitchen was spacious, with older appliances that looked well maintained. A wooden table with 4 chairs sat near a window overlooking the forest. But what caught my eye was a sheet of paper pinned to the wall beside the refrigerator. David pointed to it. "These are the rules. You need to memorize them." I stepped closer, expecting standard caretaker instructions about generator maintenance or what to do if the pipes froze. Instead, I found 5 numbered items written in bold black ink, each one underlined with what looked like multiple passes of the pen. 1. Keep all lights on from sunset to sunrise. 2. Never open the door after dark, no matter what you hear. 3. Roll the die once daily. If it lands on 6, call the number immediately. 4. Ignore any knocking after dark. 5. Do not enter the basement under any circumstances. I read the list twice, waiting for the punchline. When none came, I turned to find David watching me with those unnervingly serious eyes. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked, forcing a laugh. "Sounds like the setup for a horror movie." David didn't even crack a smile. "This isn't a joke, Mitchell. These rules will keep you alive." The way he said it, flat, matter of fact, without a hint of humor, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Alive? What exactly am I dealing with out here? David crossed his arms. "You're dealing with a job. A well-paying job that requires following 5 simple rules. That's all you need to know." I wanted to press him further, but something in his expression stopped me. Instead, I turned back to the list and read it again. "The first rule," David continued, his tone softening slightly. "The lights. The generator has enough capacity to run every light in this place all night. There's a backup system if the main generator fails. I'll show you both later." "Every light? That seems excessive. The electric bill must be—" "The company covers all expenses," he cut me off. "And it's not excessive, it's necessary." I nodded slowly, deciding to play along. "Okay. And the second rule? Never open the door after dark?" "Exactly what it says. Once the sun sets, that door stays closed until morning. No exceptions." "What if there's an emergency? What if someone needs help?" David's expression hardened. "No one will need help out here. We're 30 miles from the nearest cabin, and those people only come up in summer. In October, there's no one around for miles. Anyone who shows up at your door after dark isn't someone you want to let in." The conviction in his voice sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Rule 3, he continued, pointing to the list. "The die is in the drawer there. Roll it once every day, doesn't matter when. If it lands on 6, call the number I've written on the back of the list. Tell whoever answers that you rolled a 6, give them your name and location, then hang up. What's the purpose of that?" "Insurance," was all he said. Rule 4 is straightforward. If you hear knocking at night, ignore it. Don't investigate, don't respond, don't even acknowledge it. And 5... He paused, his weathered face growing even more serious. "The basement door is locked. The key is in the same drawer as the die, but don't use it. Don't go down there, not even during daylight." "What's in the basement?" I asked. "Nothing that concerns you as long as that door stays locked." I stared at the list again, a growing unease settling in my stomach. I'd taken this job because it seemed perfect. 6 months in a remote cabin, maintaining the property through the winter for a generous salary. I'd needed to get away from the city, from my life there, and this had seemed ideal. Now I wasn't so sure. "Look," David said, seeming to sense my hesitation. "The job is simple. Keep the place running, check the perimeter fences once a week, make sure nothing breaks or freezes. Just follow these 5 rules while you do it, and everything will be fine." I wanted to ask more questions, but David was already moving toward the back door. "Let me show you the generator setup." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of practical information. David showed me the main generator housed in a small shed behind the cabin, explaining its operation in detail. He pointed out the backup batteries in a separate enclosure, the water pump system, the propane tanks for the kitchen stove. Everything was meticulously maintained and labeled with operating instructions. We walked the perimeter of the cleared area around the cabin, David pointing out the landmarks I should check weekly. He showed me where the maintenance tools were stored, how to operate the satellite phone since there was no cell service, and where to find emergency supplies if bad weather hit. Throughout it all, I kept waiting for him to crack, to admit the rules were some kind of initiation prank played on new caretakers. But his grim demeanor never wavered, and his eyes held a wariness that seemed to deepen as the afternoon wore on, and shadows began to lengthen across the clearing. Around 4 o'clock, David checked his watch and abruptly announced he needed to leave. "I thought you'd stay the night," I said, surprised. "Maybe show me the ropes for a full day?" He shook his head while gathering his personal belongings, which weren't many. "Need to make it down the mountain before dark. You'll be fine. I've shown you everything important." I followed him to his truck, still expecting, hoping that he'd drop the act and explain the real purpose of those strange rules. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like an ordinary white die, the kind you'd find in any board game. He placed it in my palm. It felt heavier than it should have, like it was made of stone rather than plastic. "Roll it every day," he repeated. "And follow the rules, Mitchell. No exceptions. No matter what happens, no matter what you hear or think you see, follow the rules." With that, he climbed into his truck and started the engine. I stood in the driveway watching as he drove away, the die clutched in my hand, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. The trees suddenly seemed to press closer around the clearing, and the mountain air felt colder than it had just moments before. As David's truck disappeared around the bend, I turned back to face the cabin, my home for the next 6 months. The rules pinned to the kitchen wall waited inside, along with whatever secrets this place held that made a grown man's eyes fill with such unmistakable fear. The crunch of David's truck tires faded into the distance, leaving me alone with the cabin and that unsettling list of rules. I spent the next hour unpacking my things, trying to settle in while constantly glancing at the kitchen wall where those 5 commandments were pinned. The die sat heavily in my pocket, a constant reminder of whatever strange situation I'd walked into. I busied myself with practical tasks, I arranged my clothes in the bedroom dresser, stocked the pantry with the supplies I'd brought, and explored the cabin more thoroughly than David's hurried tour had allowed. The place was surprisingly spacious. 2 bedrooms upstairs, the main living area and kitchen downstairs. And of course the basement I wasn't supposed to enter. My fingers traced the edge of the basement door as I passed it. The key remained in the drawer where David had shown me, but I resisted the urge to grab it. Something about the way he'd warned me made me take that rule seriously, even if I wasn't sure about the others. As I checked the water pressure in the bathroom sink, I noticed the shadows growing longer through the window. The sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in deepening blues and purples. Rule number 1 echoed in my head. Keep all lights on from sunset to sunrise. Guess it's time, I muttered to myself, moving methodically through the cabin. I flipped on every switch I could find, ceiling lights, wall sconces, lamps on end tables and desks. The cabin blazed to life, bathed in warm yellow light that seemed excessive and wasteful. But as I watched the last sliver of sun disappear behind the jagged mountain peaks, I felt an instinctive relief at the brightness surrounding me. The darkness that settled over the mountains wasn't like city darkness, broken by street lamps and headlights and the glow of buildings. This was an absolute, pressing darkness that seemed to push against the windows like something physical. The light from the cabin created a small bubble of visibility that ended abruptly a few yards from the walls, beyond which lay nothing but impenetrable black. I stood at the front window for a long moment, watching as familiar shapes, trees, my truck, the woodpile, disappeared into that consuming darkness. The generator's steady hum became oddly comforting, a mechanical heartbeat promising that the lights would stay on. With nothing else to do, I made dinner, a simple meal of pasta and jarred sauce, and tried to ignore how exposed I felt with the windows turning into perfect mirrors as night deepened outside. Anyone or anything could be watching me, and I wouldn't be able to see them unless they stepped directly into the light. This is ridiculous, I told myself as I washed my dishes. There's nothing out there but trees and maybe some wildlife. To distract myself, I grabbed a book from my bag and settled into the armchair near the fireplace. I built up the fire that David had started earlier, appreciating its warmth and extra light. The novel was a thriller I'd been meaning to read for months, and I forced myself to focus on the pages rather than the darkness pressing against the windows. Around 10 o'clock, something caught my eye, a movement outside the front window. I looked up from my book, squinting to see past the reflection of the cabin's interior. There, just beyond the circle of light cast by the exterior bulbs, stood a figure. My breath caught in my throat. It was tall, taller than any person should be, and completely motionless. Its shape was human-like but wrong somehow, too thin and angular. I couldn't make out any features in the darkness, just a black silhouette against even blacker night. It was watching me. I couldn't see eyes, couldn't see a face at all, but I felt its attention as surely as if it had called my name. My first instinct was to jump up, to go to the window for a better look, or even step outside to confront whatever it was. But David's warnings rushed back to me. Never open the door after dark, no matter what you hear. I forced my gaze back to my book, though the words blurred together meaninglessly. Every cell in my body wanted to look back up, to check if the figure was still there, if it had moved closer. I resisted for what felt like an eternity, my knuckles white against the book's cover. When I finally allowed myself another glance, the figure remained in exactly the same position, unmoving, watching. I remembered my phone in my pocket and pulled it out, thinking I could take a picture. But when I aimed the camera toward the window, the screen showed nothing but the reflection of the cabin interior against glass. Whatever stood out there didn't register on my phone's camera. Time stretched like taffy as I sat paralyzed in the armchair. I couldn't focus on reading anymore. but I kept the book open on my lap, stealing glances at the window every few minutes. The figure never moved, never came closer, but never left either. After what my watch told me was 2 hours, though it felt much longer, I looked up to find the window empty. The figure was gone. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My shirt was damp with sweat despite the chill that had settled over the room as the fire burned down. I added another log, watching the flames leap higher, grateful for their dancing light. Sleep was out of the question. I moved through the cabin, checking and rechecking that the doors were locked. I tested windows, drew curtains closed where they were available, and positioned myself in the kitchen where I could see both the front and back entrances. The generator continued its steady hum outside, powering the dozens of lights that now felt like my only protection. I brewed coffee around 2 a.m, determined to stay awake until dawn. The hot liquid burned down my throat, but I welcomed the sensation. Anything to keep me alert. As I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the rules pinned to the wall, I thought about calling David. The satellite phone sat on the counter, and I was sure he'd given me his number. But what would I say? That I saw a weird shadow and got scared? That didn't seem worth disturbing him for, especially when nothing had actually happened. The night stretched endlessly. I paced, read, made more coffee, checked the locks again. Every sound from the surrounding forest made me tense. The crack of a branch, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the occasional distant howl that might have been a wolf. When the first gray light of dawn finally appeared at the eastern window, relief washed over me so powerfully that my knees weakened. I slumped into a chair, exhausted, but alive. Outside, the world gradually reappeared from the darkness. Trees, rocks, the gravel driveway, all innocent and normal in the morning light. I switched off the lights one by one, saving electricity now that daylight was returning. The generator's hum faded as its burden lightened. In the growing quiet, I stared at the list of rules, seeing them with new eyes. These weren't the paranoid ramblings of an isolated mountain man. They weren't a joke or an initiation ritual. They were survival instructions, written with deadly seriousness by someone who knew exactly what lurked in the darkness around this cabin. And I had 5 more months of nights ahead of me. I scraped together a simple dinner from the supplies I'd brought, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind replayed the unsettling events of the previous night. The tall figure watching from beyond the light had left me rattled and sleep-deprived. I'd managed a few hours of restless sleep during the day, but exhaustion clung to me like a second skin as I stirred a pot of canned stew on the stove. The sunset had come earlier today, darkness swallowing the mountain before I'd even started cooking. True to my new routine, I'd switched on every light in the cabin the moment shadows began creeping across the floor. The generator hummed steadily outside, a reassuring mechanical lullaby that promised the darkness would stay where it belonged. Outside. My stomach growled as the rich smell of beef and vegetables filled the kitchen. I hadn't eaten much all day, too busy securing the cabin and checking the generator to make sure last night wouldn't repeat itself. Not that I had any idea how to prevent whatever that thing was from standing outside my window again. Just wildlife, I told myself for the 100th time, knowing I was lying. No animal stood that still or watched with such focused intent. No animal vanished from a camera lens like it didn't exist. I was just about to ladle the stew into a bowl when I heard it. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The voice was small and high-pitched, a child's voice drifting through the walls from somewhere outside. I froze, spatula suspended over the pot. "Please, I need help. I'm cold." A girl. She sounded young, maybe 7 or 8 years old, and frightened. My heart rate spiked immediately. "Hello, is someone in there? I can see the lights." The voice cracked with a sob that tightened my chest. I set down the spatula and moved toward the front door without thinking. What was a child doing out here alone after dark? 30 miles from the nearest seasonal cabin, David had said. It made no sense. "Please let me in. I'm so scared." My hand reached for the deadbolt, fingers closing around the cold metal. One quick turn and I could open the door, bring the poor kid inside where it was warm and safe. Then David's voice echoed in my head. "Never open the door after dark, no matter what you hear." I stopped, my hand still on the lock. The warnings, the rules, they seemed so ridiculous in the face of a child in danger. What kind of person would I be if I left a little girl outside in the October mountain cold? "Please," her voice rose in pitch, desperate. "My parents, we were camping and I got lost. I've been walking for hours." I pressed my forehead against the wooden door, every instinct screaming at me to open it. "How did you get all the way out here?" I called through the door, hoping my voice carried. "The nearest campground is miles away." "I don't know. I just kept walking and saw your lights. Please let me in. I'm freezing out here." My hand tightened on the bolt. I could just crack the door, look outside to verify it was really a child. No, the rules were clear. I forced my hand away from the lock and backed up several steps. "I'm sorry," I called out, hating myself. "I can't open the door after dark. It's the rules." A pause, then, "Please, mister, I'm so cold. I don't understand why you won't help me." The pleading in her voice cut through me like a knife. What was I doing? Following some paranoid mountain man's arbitrary rules instead of helping a child in need. "Thomas, is your name Thomas? I heard someone call you that." The girl's voice had moved, now coming from the side of the cabin. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. No one had called me by name here. David had always called me Mitchell during his brief stay. There was no one else around who knew my first name. "How do you know my name?" I asked, moving toward the kitchen window where her voice now seemed to originate. A small sob was the only answer. I peered through the glass but saw nothing in the pool of light cast by the exterior bulbs. The darkness beyond was absolute. "Thomas, please help me. I'm so scared of the dark. There are things out here with me." I stood frozen at the window, straining to see any sign of her. The rules suddenly felt less arbitrary. The voice continued for what felt like forever, moving around the cabin like she was pacing its perimeter. Sometimes she sobbed quietly, sometimes she called my name, sometimes she described being cold and scared. She claimed her parents had been camping, that they'd somehow left her behind, that she'd been walking for hours following the lights of my cabin. I tracked her movements by her voice, rushing from window to window, looking out into the illuminated yard. Never once did I see a child, or anything else, moving out there. "Thomas, why won't you let me in?" Her voice came from near the back door now, tiny and frightened. "Don't you care? I thought grown-ups were supposed to help kids." Every word was a barb under my skin. I pressed my back against the door, sliding down until I sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest. My hands trembled as I covered my ears, trying to block out the guilt-laden pleas. "I can't," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "I'm sorry, but I can't." I checked my watch. The voice had been circling the cabin for nearly 20 minutes now. No real child would stay outside calling for this long without trying something else, seeking shelter in the shed, perhaps, or giving up and moving on. Around midnight, something changed. The voice called my name again, but it sounded wrong. "Thumas," it said, drawing out the vowel unnaturally. "I'm so very cold, Thomas." The pitch was slightly different, still childlike, but measured and deliberate, as if someone were carefully controlling each syllable. The cadence was off, too mechanical, like a poor imitation of how a child should sound. "Let me in, Thomas. I promise I won't hurt you. I just need warmth, flesh warmth. Thomas." Ice spread through my veins at those words. Whatever was outside, it wasn't a lost little girl. It never had been. "Go away," I said, voice surprisingly steady despite my racing heart. "You're not getting in here." A giggle answered me, still in that child's voice, but all wrong. Too low at the end, too knowing. "But I'm so hungry, Thomas. So cold and hungry." I backed away from the door, retreating to the center of the cabin where the lights were brightest. The voice followed, circling, always staying just outside the light. "I know you're alone in there," it said, voice fluctuating between childish and something older, raspier. "No one would know if you let me in. No one would blame you. What kind of monster ignores a crying child?" I sat in the armchair by the fire, eyes fixed on the windows and doors, listening as the thing outside tried every angle, every emotional appeal. It begged, it cried, it raged. It switched between sounding like a frightened child and something ancient pretending to be young. By the time dawn lightened the eastern sky, the voice had fallen silent. I hadn't slept a minute, my nerves raw and frayed from the constant psychological assault. As sunlight gradually reclaimed the forest, I switched off the lights and unlocked the front door with shaking hands. The morning air bit at my face as I stepped onto the porch, looking for any sign of what had tormented me all night. The dirt around the cabin was still slightly damp from yesterday's light rain, perfect for capturing footprints. I circled the entire building, checking every inch of ground where the voice had been. Nothing. Not a single footprint, not a disturbance in the soil, not a broken twig on the low bushes that pressed close to the cabin walls. Nothing had walked here during the night. At least nothing that left tracks. I stood in the morning sunlight, letting its warmth push back against the cold dread that had settled in my bones. The rules made sense now. Not opening the door after dark wasn't paranoia or superstition. It was survival. Whatever roamed these mountains after sunset wasn't human, even when it pretended to be, even when it sounded like a child who needed my help. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, even though daylight supposedly meant safety. The die sat on the kitchen counter where I'd left it, waiting for its daily roll. I picked it up, feeling its unusual weight in my palm, and wondered what other rules I'd be tested on before my 6 months here were done. I woke up on my 4th day at the cabin feeling oddly refreshed. After 2 nights of supernatural encounters, my 3rd day had passed with blessed normalcy. I'd spent it chopping firewood, organizing supplies, and generally settling into a routine that felt almost peaceful in the daylight hours. The night had been quiet too. No figures watching from beyond the light. No childlike voices begging to be let in. I'd even managed to sleep through most of it, waking only to check that the lights remained on. My coffee brewed while I watched the sunrise paint the pine trees gold. The mountain air felt crisp coming through the cracked kitchen window, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. I poured the steaming liquid into my mug and sat at the wooden table, savoring the quiet moment. The white die caught my eye where it sat on the counter. I hadn't rolled it yesterday, despite David's instructions to do so daily. Nothing bad had happened. Maybe some of these rules were just superstitious nonsense after all. I picked up the die, feeling its unusual weight. It was cool against my palm as I shook it absently. "Might as well get it over with," I said to the empty kitchen. I let the die tumble across the table. It bounced twice before settling on 6 dots facing upward. I stared at it, coffee halfway to my lips. 6. According to Rule 3, I needed to call that number now. But what would happen if I didn't? The rule about keeping lights on made sense after seeing that tall figure watching me. Not opening the door seemed wise after the fake child incident. But calling a random number because of a die roll, that seemed arbitrary and strange. I finished my coffee while looking at the 6 dots. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, making everything seem so normal, so non-threatening. What could possibly happen if I skipped making one phone call? "This is ridiculous," I muttered, standing up and rinsing my mug in the sink. I had actual work to do today. The gutters needed cleaning before the next rainfall, and I wanted to double-check the propane tanks to make sure they were full for the coming weeks. That phone call could wait, or maybe I'd just skip it entirely and prove to myself that at least some of these rules were unnecessary. I pulled on my work jacket and boots, grabbed my tools, and headed outside. The mountain air was invigorating, the forest peaceful in the morning light. Nothing supernatural here, just trees, rocks, and the occasional bird call. The gutter cleaning took most of my morning. I worked methodically, clearing pine needles and debris from each section. Balanced on the ladder, I could see miles of undisturbed forest stretching below the cabin clearing. The view was breathtaking. All those trees, that endless wild space. For a moment, I forgot about the dye, about the rules, about everything strange that had happened. I was just a man doing maintenance work in a beautiful setting. By midday, I'd finished with the gutters and moved on to checking the propane tanks behind the cabin. They were nearly full, as David had said, but I made notes about their levels anyway. I liked having data, having control over something in this increasingly unpredictable situation. As afternoon stretched on, I tidied the shed, organized tools, and split more firewood for the coming nights. Physical labor felt good after the tension of the past few days. Each swing of the axe drove the memory of that pale, angular figure further from my mind. Each stack of wood I built seemed like a bulwark against the voice that had pretended to be a child. I barely thought about the die sitting on the kitchen table, the 6 dots facing upward, the phone call I hadn't made. Sunset came earlier than I expected. I was still outside securing the woodpile with a tarp when I noticed the light fading. I hurried to finish my task, not wanting to be caught outside after dark. The rules about the lights and the door had proven themselves necessary. I wasn't taking chances with those. I made it inside just as dusk deepened into night. Moving through the cabin, I switched on every light, the warm glow pushing back the darkness that pressed against the windows. The generator hummed steadily outside, a reassuring sound that had become part of the cabin's soundtrack. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since a quick sandwich at noon. I hung my jacket by the door and turned toward the kitchen. That's when I saw her. A woman stood in the far corner of the living room, between the fireplace and the hallway that led to the kitchen. She was pale and still, her edges slightly blurred as if she were a photograph taken with a shaky hand. Her dress was high-necked and long-sleeved, the style at least 50 years out of date. Her hair was pulled back severely from a face that might have been pretty once, before whatever had happened to make her like this. I froze, one hand still on my jacket, unable to process what I was seeing. She wasn't solid. The corner of the fireplace was faintly visible through her torso, but she wasn't quite transparent either. She existed somewhere between presence and absence, between something and nothing. Her eyes were the worst part. They were hollow, not in the figurative sense, but literally. Dark, empty sockets that somehow still held awareness. They fixed on me with horrible attention, seeing me while showing nothing of herself. "Hello?" I managed, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. She didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't move at all. I tried again, louder this time. "Can you hear me? Who are you?" Nothing. Just that unrelenting stare from eyes that weren't eyes at all. I needed to move past her to reach the kitchen, to get to the satellite phone. The moment the thought formed, I knew with certainty that this apparition was connected to my ignored die roll. I'd broken a rule, and now something was in the cabin with me. But I couldn't make myself approach her. The very idea of walking past those empty eye sockets, of potentially brushing against whatever substance she was made of, sent cold sweat trickling down my back. Instead, I backed up until my legs hit the armchair, then sank into it without taking my eyes off her. She remained motionless in her corner, watching me with that empty gaze. Minutes stretched into an hour. She never moved, never blinked, never spoke, just stood there staring at me with those horrible, hollow eyes. I tried to convince myself she wasn't real, that I was hallucinating from stress or lack of sleep. But every time I gathered the courage to look away, even for a second, she was still there when I looked back, exactly as she had been, unchanging, waiting. The night crawled by. Every so often I checked my watch, marking the slow passage of time. 10 o'clock, midnight, 2 in the morning. I didn't dare sleep, though exhaustion pulled at my limbs and made my eyelids heavy. Somehow I knew that sleeping in her presence would be dangerous, though I couldn't have explained why. At one point, my bladder screaming for relief, I was forced to inch toward the downstairs bathroom, keeping as much distance between us as possible. She didn't turn to follow my movement, but those hollow eyes seemed to track me nonetheless. I kept the bathroom door open while I used the toilet, too afraid to let her out of my sight even for those brief moments. By 4 in the morning, my back ached from sitting rigidly in the chair, and my eyes burned from staring. I'd given up trying to make sense of her presence. I simply endured it, counting the minutes until dawn. When the first gray light of morning finally appeared at the windows, I watched as she began to fade. There was no dramatic disappearance, no sudden vanishing. She simply grew less and less substantial as natural light filled the room, until there was nothing left of her at all. I sat for several minutes more, making sure she was truly gone. Then I bolted for the kitchen, grabbing the satellite phone from its charging cradle. My hands trembled as I dialed the number written on the back of the rules list. It rang 4 times before clicking over to voicemail. David's gruff voice instructed me to leave a message. "David, it's Thomas Mitchell at the cabin," I said, my voice hoarse from a night of silence. "I rolled a 6 yesterday morning, but I didn't call. I thought the rule was stupid." I swallowed hard, remembering those hollow eyes. There was a woman in the cabin all night. Pale, see-through, wearing an old-fashioned dress. She just stood there watching me until sunrise. I couldn't get past her to reach the kitchen. I paused, gathering my thoughts. "I'm sorry, I get it now. I won't skip the call again, I promise. Please call me back when you can." I set the phone down and sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly exhausted. The die still sat on the table where I'd left it yesterday morning, 6 dots facing upward in silent accusation. I picked it up, turning it over in my palm, feeling its unusual weight. No more testing the rules. No more thinking I knew better than David. Whatever was happening in and around this cabin was real, and the rules were the only thing keeping me safe. I looked at the die again, then carefully placed it back in its drawer. I'd roll it again tomorrow, and if it came up 6, I'd make that call immediately, no matter what. I hung up the satellite phone and slumped against the kitchen counter, exhaustion dragging at my limbs. The ghostly woman with the hollow eyes had vanished with the morning light, but the memory of her unblinking stare remained burned into my mind. I couldn't believe I'd been stupid enough to ignore one of David's rules. After making myself a strong cup of coffee, I wandered through the cabin, checking each room, irrationally afraid I might find her lingering in some corner. The cabin felt normal again in the daylight, just wood and stone and ordinary furniture. No pale figures, no hollow eyes. I spent the morning doing small repairs around the cabin that I'd been putting off, trying to keep myself busy. The physical work helped clear my head. By early afternoon, exhaustion caught up with me. I hadn't slept at all during the woman's vigil, and my eyelids grew heavier with each passing minute. Eventually, I gave up fighting it and retreated to my bedroom for a nap, making sure to set an alarm that would wake me well before sunset so I could turn on all the lights. Sleep came instantly, dreamless and deep. I was jolted awake by a sound cutting through my unconsciousness. 5 distinct knocks on the front door, then silence, then 5 more. The rhythm was deliberate, measured, almost mechanical in its precision. I jerked upright, heart racing as I fumbled for my watch on the bedside table. The glowing dial read 2:30 in the morning. My alarm had done its job hours ago. I remembered waking at dusk, turning on all the lights throughout the cabin, and then returning to bed, too exhausted to stay up. I glanced around the bedroom, relieved to see the lamp still casting its protective glow. 5 knocks. Pause. 5 knocks. The sound carried clearly through the cabin, each impact against the wooden door identical in force and timing. Not urgent, not hesitant, just perfectly steady, as if whoever was knocking had all the time in the world. David's 4th rule flashed in my mind. Ignore any knocking after dark. Don't investigate. Don't respond. Don't acknowledge it. I sat up in bed, covers bunched around my waist, listening. My first instinct was to call out, to ask who was there. But the rule was clear. Don't acknowledge it in any way. 5 knocks. Pause. 5 knocks. I pulled the covers up higher, feeling childish but unable to stop myself. The knocking continued, never varying in its rhythm or intensity. I found myself counting the sets, 10, 15, 20. Whoever, or whatever, was outside showed no signs of giving up or growing impatient. My curiosity warred with caution. What would happen if I answered? Would I find another tall, angular figure like the one that had watched me through the window? Or something that mimicked a child's voice? Or something entirely new? 5 knocks. Pause. 5 knocks. The bedside clock ticked past 3 in the morning. The knocking had continued for over half an hour without stopping. My initial fear had given way to a strange, reluctant fascination. The precision was almost hypnotic. I found myself anticipating each set, counting along silently. I wondered if this was a test. Maybe David was outside, checking if I would follow the rules, even when they seemed arbitrary. But then I remembered the woman with the hollow eyes and the voice that had known my name without being told. This was no test. At least, not a human one. 5 knocks. Pause. 5 knocks. By 3:30, I'd grown almost accustomed to the sound. It had become part of the cabin's nighttime symphony, the generator's hum, the occasional creak of wood contracting in the cold, and now these steady knocks. I leaned back against the headboard, still listening but no longer startled by each new set. 5 knocks. Pause. 5 knocks. Just after 4 in the morning, the knocking stopped. The silence felt sudden and almost as intrusive as the noise had been. I waited, counting seconds in my head, expecting the pattern to resume. But a minute passed, then 5, then 10, and nothing came. Finally, I gathered my courage and slipped out of bed. The wooden floor was cold against my bare feet as I crept through the hallway toward the front of the cabin. Every light was still blazing, casting the interior in a warm yellow glow that felt increasingly like a lifeline. I approached the living room windows carefully, staying to the side to avoid being immediately visible from outside. Slowly, I leaned forward until I could see the front porch and the small clearing beyond. Nothing. The exterior lights illuminated empty wooden planks and a few feet of dirt and gravel. No figure stood in the circle of light or just beyond it. No movement disturbed the night. It was as if the knocker had never been there at all. I checked the front door, confirming it was still locked and secure. The knob showed no signs of tampering, and the deadbolt remained firmly in place. Whatever had been knocking hadn't tried to break in. Just to be acknowledged, to be let in voluntarily. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the darkness outside gradually give way to gray dawn light. As the sun rose, turning the pine trees gold and green, the night's visitation seemed increasingly dreamlike. Had I imagined the knocking? Had it been some animal, perhaps a deer, bumping against the door? But I knew better. The pattern had been too regular, too deliberate. This had been something else, something that wanted inside. The morning passed in a haze of exhaustion. I forced myself to eat breakfast and complete some basic chores. The wood supply was running low, so I decided to check the stack behind the cabin. The physical activity might help clear my head. The October air was crisp and refreshing as I walked around the building. Birds called from the surrounding forest, and a light breeze rustled the pine needles. Everything seemed so normal, so natural in the daylight. I rounded the corner to where the woodpile was stacked against the cabin's back wall. Most of the logs I'd split yesterday were still there, neatly arranged under the tarp I'd secured. I'd need to split more soon, but we had enough for a few more days. As I adjusted the tarp, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I looked up sharply, focusing on the small rectangular window set low in the foundation wall, a basement window. A pale face was pressed against the glass, watching me, childlike in size and shape, but wrong somehow. The proportions slightly off, the features blurry. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before it darted away from the window, disappearing into the darkness of the basement. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the woodpile. The basement. The fifth rule: never enter the basement under any circumstances. My gaze dropped to where the basement door was set into the ground nearby, sloping down from the yard. It was secured with a heavy padlock that looked ancient, the metal discolored with age and exposure. Rust had formed around its base, suggesting it hadn't been opened in years. Yet something was down there. Something that looked like a child, but couldn't possibly be one. I backed away from the window, from the locked door, from whatever lived beneath the cabin. David's warning echoed in my mind. Nothing in the basement concerned me as long as the door remained locked. I retreated to the safety of the cabin, locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I poured myself a glass of water. The sight of that pale face, so briefly glimpsed, had shaken me more than the night's knocking. It had been inside the cabin, or at least inside a part of it, separated from my living space by nothing more than a locked interior door. I glanced at the basement door in the hallway, the key still safely in the kitchen drawer. For a wild moment, I considered unlocking it, going down to confront whatever lived there. Wouldn't it be better to know exactly what I was dealing with? No. That would be breaking another rule, and I'd already seen the consequences of that. The woman with the hollow eyes had been terrifying enough. I didn't want to discover what happened if I opened that basement door. The day crawled by. I stayed inside, checking and rechecking the locks on all doors and windows. I kept finding myself staring at the basement door, listening for any sound from below. But the cabin remained quiet aside from the usual creaks and settling noises. As evening approached, I lit the fireplace and turned on all the lights before darkness fell. The die sat on the kitchen table, waiting for its daily roll. I picked it up reluctantly, remembering what had happened the last time it had shown a 6. I let it tumble across the wooden surface, holding my breath as it came to rest. 6 dots faced upward again. Of course, I muttered, reaching for the satellite phone. This time I wasn't going to ignore the rule. I dialed the number written on the back of the rules list and waited as it rang. To my surprise, David answered on the 3rd ring. "Mitchell," he said, his voice as gruff as I remembered. "Got your message earlier. You saw her, did you?" "Yes," I replied, relieved to hear another human voice. She stood in the corner all night just watching me with those empty eyes. "She won't hurt you directly," David said, "but she can block your path, keep you from getting to what you need. That's why we make the call when the die shows 6. Keeps her away." I hesitated, then added, "There's more. Last night someone knocked on the door for over an hour. 5 knocks, then a pause, then 5 more. Over and over again." David was silent for so long I thought we'd lost the connection. "David, are you still there?" "I'm here," he said, his voice noticeably grimmer. "The knocking. That's new, or at least it's been a long time since it happened." "What does it mean?" "Nothing good." He paused again. "Did you answer it? Acknowledge it in any way?" "No, I stayed in bed and just listened. It eventually stopped around 4 in the morning." "Good." The relief in his voice was palpable. "That's good, Mitchell. You did the right thing." I took a deep breath before continuing. "There's one more thing. Today, I saw something in the basement, through the outside window. It looked like a child, but wrong somehow. It was watching me, then it disappeared when I saw it." The silence that followed was even longer than before. When David finally spoke, his voice was tight with what sounded like controlled fear. "Stay away from the basement, Mitchell. Both doors. Don't even look through the windows. The thing down there, it's not like the others. It's been there a long time." "What is it?" I asked, dreading the answer. "The reason for the rules," David said simply. "I'm coming up tomorrow. Don't roll the die again until I get there, and Mitchell?" "Yes?" "If the knocking starts again tonight, don't answer. No matter what you hear, no matter what it says or does. Do you understand me?" "I understand," I said, though a cold weight had settled in my stomach. "When will you be here?" "Early afternoon, weather permitting. Keep the lights on. Follow the rules. I'll see you tomorrow." The line went dead before I could ask any more questions. I set the phone down slowly, staring at the basement door across the hallway. Whatever was happening in this cabin, whatever lived in these mountains, David knew more than he'd initially shared, and now he was coming back, presumably to tell me the rest. I just had to make it through one more night. I spent the rest of that day pacing, checking windows, and jumping at every sound while waiting for David. The satellite phone call had left me with more questions than answers, and the way his voice had tightened when I mentioned the basement creature haunted me. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale, wrong-proportioned face pressed against the basement window. Instead, I busied myself with small tasks around the cabin, organizing supplies, checking the generator's fuel levels, and making sure every light bulb was in working order. The thought of another night of knocking, or worse, kept my hands busy while my mind raced. Morning came with painful slowness. I stood at the kitchen window with my third cup of coffee, watching the gravel road for any sign of David's truck. The trees swayed in a light mountain breeze, innocent and peaceful in the daylight. It was hard to believe that after dark, this same forest harbored things that knocked with mechanical precision and pressed pale faces against basement windows. Just before noon, I heard the distant rumble of an engine. I rushed to the front door, relief washing over me as David's weathered pickup appeared around the bend in the road. He parked beside my truck and climbed out slowly, carrying a duffel bag that looked heavy. The same haunted expression I remembered from our first meeting was etched deeper into his face now. "Mitchell?" he said with a nod as he climbed the porch steps. No smile, no handshake. Just that gruff acknowledgement. "Thanks for coming," I said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I wasn't sure you would." David set his bag down just inside the door and surveyed the cabin with practiced eyes. "Things are happening faster than they should," he said, ignoring my comment. "The knocking doesn't usually start until the 3rd month." I closed and locked the door behind him, a habit I'd developed even in daylight. "What's going on, David? What aren't you telling me?" He moved to the kitchen without answering, setting his bag on the table and unzipping it. From inside, he pulled out several packages wrapped in brown paper. "Extra batteries," he said, placing them on the table. "Flashlights, salt, iron filings." He looked up at me, his weathered face grave. "The entities are becoming more aggressive, testing the boundaries more frequently than usual." "Entities?" I repeated. "What exactly are they?" David sighed and sank into a kitchen chair. He suddenly looked older, the lines in his face deeper in the harsh kitchen light. "I don't know what they are," he admitted. "Not exactly. They've been here longer than the cabin, longer than the first settlers in these mountains. The native tribes that lived here before had their own rules about this place. They wouldn't camp in this clearing or hunt within a mile of it." I sat across from him, struggling to process this information. Then why build a cabin here at all? Because someone didn't listen. David's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Like you almost didn't listen with the die. I've been monitoring the situation through the phone calls. You've been handling things well, considering, but the knocking incident..." He shook his head. "That means they're preparing for something bigger." Preparing? They plan? They think? In their way. David began unpacking more items from his bag. Candles, matches, a small leather pouch that clinked when he set it down. "I don't pretend to understand them. I just know the rules keep them at bay most of the time." I glanced toward the hallway where the basement door stood closed and locked. "And the thing in the basement? What is that?" David's eyes flicked to mine, then away. "That's different. Older. It's been there since before the cabin was built. The owner had the structure built around it, thinking he could control it, study it." His voice dropped. He was wrong. "Jesus," I whispered. "Why would anyone do that?" "The same reason people climb mountains or dive to the bottom of the ocean." David shrugged. "Because it's there. Because they think they're smarter than nature. Than reality." He finished unpacking his supplies and folded the empty duffel bag. "I'm staying tonight. We need to reinforce some of the protections." I felt a surge of relief knowing I wouldn't face the night alone. "What do we need to do?" David spent the afternoon showing me how to create what he called barriers. Lines of salt across thresholds, iron nails hammered into window frames, strange symbols drawn in chalk on the underside of furniture. He wouldn't explain their significance, just insisted that I memorize their patterns and placements. "The company that owns this place," I said as we worked. "Do they know about all this?" David gave me a long look. "The company is a shell, Mitchell. A legal fiction. The real owner is the thing in the basement." I nearly dropped the hammer I was holding. "What? How is that possible? Lawyers, proxies, shell corporations. The modern world makes it easy to hide what you really are." David took the hammer from my nerveless fingers and continued driving iron nails into the doorframe. "It needs a caretaker, someone to maintain the structure, keep the generator running, follow the rules." "Why? What happens if no one's here?" "It gets out." David's voice was flat. "The last time that happened was 1962. 3 towns downriver were destroyed in what the history books call a catastrophic flood." "Wasn't a flood." I stared at him, trying to detect any sign he was lying or exaggerating. His face remained impassive, focused on his work. "Why me?" I finally asked. "Why choose me for this job?" "I didn't choose you. It did." David nodded toward the basement door. "It always chooses. I just handle the interviews." My skin crawled at the thought of being selected by whatever was locked in the basement. I wanted to ask more questions, but David's expression made it clear he was done explaining for now. As sunset approached, we checked all the lights one last time. David had me roll the die. It came up 4, and we settled in for what I knew would be a long night. Darkness fell quickly in the mountains, the sky deepening from blue to purple to black within minutes. We sat in the living room, a fire crackling in the hearth, adding extra warmth and light to the electrically illuminated cabin. David had positioned himself where he could see both the front door and the hallway leading to the basement door. I noticed he kept a shotgun across his lap. Not the decorative one from above the mantel, but a more practical, well-used model he'd brought with him. "Will that work against them?" I asked, nodding toward the weapon. "Probably not," he admitted, "but it makes me feel better." The first few hours passed quietly. We talked little, both listening to the sounds of the night outside. The generator's steady hum, the occasional hoot of an owl, the wind rustling through pine needles. Normal sounds, natural sounds. Around midnight, things changed. The first indication was a branch breaking somewhere in the forest, a sharp crack that echoed through the night. Not unusual in itself, but it was followed by another, then another. Systematic, like something large moving through the trees, snapping branches deliberately. David's head turned toward the sound, his expression alert but not surprised. "Is that them?" I whispered. He nodded once. "One of them." More branches broke, the sound circling the cabin in a slow, deliberate pattern. Then came the growls, low, rumbling sounds that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Not like any animal I'd ever heard, too deep and somehow hollow, as if coming from something with a chest cavity much larger than any natural creature's. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. "What's it doing?" "Testing," David replied, his eyes tracking the sounds as they moved around the cabin. "Learning our reactions. Stay calm." The growls continued for nearly an hour, sometimes close enough that I imagined the creature pressed against the cabin walls, sometimes fading into the distance as if losing interest, only to return minutes later. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, making the pine needles sound like murmured conversations, but the sounds solidified into distinct voices, dozens of them, speaking softly just beyond the range of comprehension. The languages shifted and changed, sometimes sounding almost like English, then sliding into something guttural and ancient, then becoming musical and flowing, then harsh and clipped. "Can you understand any of it?" I asked David, my voice barely audible. He shook his head. "Better not to try. They're not saying anything you want to hear." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, seeming to come from all directions at once. I caught fragments that almost made sense. My name, mentions of the basement, promises and threats intermingled in a dizzying babble. We sat rigid in our chairs, listening as the forest around us came alive with unnatural sounds. David's knuckles were white around the shotgun's grip, his face expressionless but alert. I tried to match his composure, but my heart hammered in my chest. The only comfort was the bright lights surrounding us, keeping the darkness and whatever lurked within it at bay. At exactly 3 a.m, according to my watch, every light in the cabin went out simultaneously. The darkness was absolute, deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. The generator's hum continued outside, steady and apparently normal, but all power to the cabin had been cut. "David?" I called, my voice embarrassingly high. "Don't move," came his response from across the room. "They're testing us." In the pitch darkness, I heard it, the slow, deliberate turning of the front door handle. Metal scraped against metal as something tested the lock, applying steady pressure, not jiggling or trying to break it, just turning with patient, terrible purpose. "The flashlight," David whispered. "On the table beside you. Turn it on, but don't point it at the windows yet." My hands fumbled across the table, knocking against something that clattered to the floor before finding the heavy metal cylinder of the flashlight. I clicked it on, pointing the beam at the ceiling. "Now the door," David instructed. "Show me the door." I swung the beam toward the front entrance. The handle had stopped turning, but something was visible through the small window in the upper portion of the door, a face pressed against the glass, watching us. It looked almost human, but the proportions were wrong, the features twisted into an expression of hunger and malice. "The windows," David said, his voice tight. "Check the windows." I moved the beam to the nearest window and felt my blood freeze. Pressed against the glass were more faces, dozens of them crowded together, all watching us with the same hungry expression. Every window I could see from my position was covered with pale, distorted faces. David, I choked out. What are they doing? Waiting, he replied. For us to break a rule, open a door, invite them in. That's all they need. As if responding to his words, the whispers outside rose to a fevered pitch. The voices now clearly begging, threatening, promising, pleading, all in languages I almost understood but couldn't quite grasp. The pressure on the door handle increased, the metal groaning under strain. And then, as suddenly as they had failed, the lights came back on. The faces vanished instantly. The whispers cut off mid-syllable. The pressure on the door handle released. The cabin was once again a bright island in a sea of normal mountain darkness. David and I sat frozen for several seconds, staring at the now empty windows. Is it over? I finally asked. For tonight. David set his shotgun aside and ran a hand over his face. He looked exhausted. They made their point, which is that they can get to us anytime they want, that the rules and protections only work because they choose to respect them, for now. He stood up slowly, his joints creaking. That's how they think. It's all a game to them. We stayed awake for the rest of the night, though nothing else happened. The forest returned to its normal nighttime sounds: wind, owls, the occasional rustle of small animals. The generator continued its steady hum. The lights remained on. When dawn finally broke, turning the eastern sky pink and gold, I felt the familiar relief washing over me. David and I watched the sunrise through the kitchen window, coffee mugs clutched in hands that still trembled slightly from the night's events. I need to get back down the mountain, David said after we'd sat in silence for a while. There are others I need to check on. Others? I looked at him sharply. Other cabins like this one? Similar situations, different entities. He drained his coffee cup and set it in the sink. Different rules. I followed him as he gathered his things, repacking his duffel bag with practiced efficiency. He left the extra supplies he'd brought, the batteries, salt, iron filings, and several of the strange chalk symbols drawn on pieces of paper. At the door, he turned to face me. You passed the real test last night, Mitchell. Staying calm when everything went wrong, not breaking the rules even when they pushed hard. His eyes, usually so guarded, held something like respect. A lot of caretakers would have run after what happened last night, or after seeing the woman with the hollow eyes, or hearing that child's voice. I considered his words, surprised to realize I hadn't even thought about leaving. Despite the terror of the night, despite the knowledge that I was sharing this mountain with things beyond my understanding, I felt an odd peace here. The rules made sense now. The danger was real, but defined. Follow the rules, survive the night, watch the sunrise. There was a simplicity to it that my complicated city life had lacked. I want to stay, I told him, for the full season. David studied my face for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. I thought you might. It chooses well, usually. He handed me a piece of paper with another phone number written on it. This is my direct line. Call if things get worse. Otherwise, I'll check in when I can. He stepped out onto the porch, the morning sunlight making him squint. There's a backup generator in the truck. I'll unload it before I go. Should give you redundancy if they try cutting the power again. I watched as he efficiently unloaded and installed the second generator, connecting it to the cabin's electrical system with the expertise of someone who'd done it many times before. When he finished, he wiped his hands on a rag and tossed it to me. Remember the rules, Mitchell. All of them. No exceptions, no matter what. I will, I promised. He climbed into his truck and started the engine. Through the open window, he said, "It gets easier. Not the things they do, that gets worse. But your ability to handle it gets better." With that parting advice, he drove away, the truck disappearing around the bend in the road, leaving me alone again with the cabin, the rules, and whatever watched from the darkness. I turned and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The die sat on the kitchen table, waiting for its daily roll. I picked it up, feeling its now familiar weight in my palm, and let it tumble across the wooden surface. 4 dots faced upward. I smiled slightly, relieved, and tucked the die back into its drawer. Another day in the mountains, another night to come. I found myself strangely looking forward to both.